On April 10, 1912, an official document was signed before departure. It was the exact record of every automobile, suitcase, and sealed crate from first class, sent down to G deck, the deepest and most isolated level of the ocean liner. This piece of paper survived intact. It is entirely public. The fracture in history happened 73 years later when expeditions finally pierced the darkness of that sunken cargo hold. What the spotlights revealed on the ocean floor did not match the paper. Heavy items were missing, things that would never dissolve in salt water. In their place, undeclared remains emerged in the dark. The sealed compartment held more than just luggage. To understand the gravity of what rests at the bottom of the ocean, we must descend into the metallic guts of the ship. The main cargo hold was located on G deck. It was the deepest level of the entire ocean liner, plunged way below the waterline. Far from the crystal chandeliers and the quiet luxury of the upper decks, this was a cold and strictly functional maze, built in pure steel and divided into 5 rigorously armored sections. Access to this area was not merely restricted, it was guarded by security officers and ruled by a non-negotiable British protocol. Every heavy trunk, every wooden crate, and every valuable item that crossed those massive doors had to pass an absolute screening by the crew. What went in was weighed, meticulously cataloged in a logbook, and sealed before the ship even left the port. Once the heavy gates of G-Deck were shut, no one could reach them. Not even the most influential first-class passengers had permission to go down to the cargo area during the crossing. And what rested in the silence of that hold formed a true fortune in transit. The official document that survived the voyage, preserved today in customs archives, lists a staggering inventory. And if you are looking to understand the real details that history often leaves behind, and if you value investigations grounded in authentic documents, consider subscribing to our channel to follow our upcoming breakdowns. Returning to the records of the time, the paper details the loading of dozens of postal parcels and crates containing priceless belongings. They were declared by at least 12 passengers from the highest financial elite. But the absolute standout item in the notes was a luxury automobile of French manufacturing, a vehicle assembled in that exact year of 1912. The shining and incredibly heavy machine belonged to a first-class passenger, a man who, on the night of the tragedy, managed to secure a spot on one of the last lifeboats. He survived against all odds, reached the mainland safely, and months later was fully compensated by the insurance company based on the official document proving his car was on the ship. The laws of physics dictate that an automobile built in the early 20th century does not vanish in salt water. The iron chassis, the engine block, the solid metal gears, all of this should remain there, entombed under tons of pressure, preserved in the abyssal dark. The car, the declared high-value goods, the heavy wooden crates. All of it was registered as locked in the deepest level. Or at least, that is what the world and the insurance companies believed to be an absolute fact. Because when the lights of the submarines cut through the darkness decades later and illuminated the interior of that lower level, the heavy vehicle simply was not where the paper said it should be. The only way to understand the true scale of this anomaly is to look at the documentary proof that escaped the tragedy. The cargo manifest is not a legend, nor is it a speculative draft. It is an absolute customs record, filed in perfect condition in the United States, the country that was meant to be the final destination of that voyage. On the pages of that dense and heavy book rests the bureaucratic testimony of what, in theory, should be locked below the waterline. There, every crate, every piece of machinery, and every luxury artifact was registered with exact handwriting by port officials. The document details the weight, the nature of the object, and the ticket class of its owner. And what catches the eye, right in the opening lines, is the unreal concentration of wealth in such a small space. There was a bit of everything on that lower level of the ship: engine parts, industrial machinery for new factories, bulky mail parcels, and a massive amount of reinforced wooden crates. Inside those crates, the records confirm the transport of fine art, rare feathers destined for high fashion, and batches of priceless items. A significant portion of this cargo was declared by some of the wealthiest passengers on the ocean liner, industrial magnates and real estate barons traveling in the most expensive suites on the upper deck. When the fatal scrape against the ice occurred, and the waters of the North Atlantic began to flood the lower levels starting from the bow, those very same passengers faced absolute chaos on the decks above. Many of them did not survive the freezing extreme of that night. Their lives ended in the dark, and with them disappeared the possibility of personally claiming the treasures they left locked at the bottom of the ship. With the loss of those lives, the customs document gained unquestionable legal weight. For the major insurance companies, what was written and stamped there was the only possible truth. Millions of dollars, in values adjusted for our time, were paid out to the heirs. The bureaucratic process was closed. The law decreed that this fortune in metals, gems, and equipment was hopelessly sealed at the bottom of the sea, resting in absolute dark, contained by the collapse of a structure of thousands of tons of steel. It was a logical, accountable, and convenient conclusion. The money changed hands in the courts, the lawsuits were archived, and silence took over the subject for exactly 73 years. But the documentary history and the physical reality crashed head-on when technology allowed human eyes to scour those collapsed corridors once again. The investigative tension starts right here. Many of the items, whose declared value in 1912 would equal uncalculable fortunes today, were never officially located in the hold by the expeditions. Where there should be heavy wooden crates and metallic structures that would never dissolve, the explorers found a chaotic void. And the most disturbing detail is not just what was missing in the dark. The critical point is that the corporation responsible for searching that space over the years never made public the complete inventory of what was actually pulled from G-Deck. An abyss of uncertainty was created between what the official paper swore existed and what the mechanical claws of the submarines actually brought back to the surface. To understand what makes this absence so deeply unsettling, we need to recreate the final moments of that early morning. The tragedy, after all, did not begin with a terrifying bang on the upper decks. The fatal blow was methodical and partially silent. A submerged lateral scrape happening far below the line of sight of the lookouts, who were patrolling the night in total darkness. The ice ripped gashes in the steel along dozens of feet, and the North Atlantic began to swallow the lower levels, always starting from the bow. G-Deck, where the cargo hold was located, was one of the very first compartments to be breached by the freezing water. While desperation began to take shape in the luxury areas and the tilt of the floor became undeniable, the sealed cargo doors were already withstanding tons of oceanic pressure. The ocean liner did not sink all at once. It was a slow and agonizing process. The front of the ship plunged deeper and deeper into the dark waters until the colossal structure could not bear its own weight and snapped in half before vanishing completely. At the heart of this collapse, in the specific sector reserved for it, should have been the French automobile from 1912. It was a massive, heavy machine, built with a reinforced chassis, solid iron axles, and a dense motor. It was anchored firmly to the steel floor to withstand the swaying of the crossing. The owner of this machine was one of the wealthiest men on board, properly accommodated in first class. On the night of the disaster, he managed to secure a space in one of the lifeboats, survived the extreme cold, and returned to the mainland. Armed with the official shipping document and backed by lawyers, he demanded and received a massive payout from the insurance company for the loss of his luxury asset. As far as the American justice system and the finances of the time were concerned, the vehicle rested beyond recovery at the bottom of the ocean. But this is exactly where the bureaucratic narrative clashes head-on with the laws of nature. And this is the peak of our investigation. Decades later, when the mechanical claws and high-resolution cameras of the expeditions descended into the dark, focusing on the exact section where the vehicle should be tied down, the automobile simply was not there. This is the most well-documented case of discrepancy in the shipwreck. The basic physics of the ocean are merciless, but they follow clear rules. Salt water and deep currents devour fabrics, leathers, and fine woods in a matter of a few years. However, a heavy metal chassis and a cast-iron engine block from the early 20th century do not evaporate. They rust, they gather sediment, but their raw physical structure holds up. A machine of that size, swallowed by deep waters, does not dissolve. If the car sank tied down to G-deck, it should be visible, or at the very least, detectable by modern expedition equipment. The fact that researchers found a chaotic void, containing only debris that does not match the vehicle's structure, creates an unbearable tension about the true history of that hold. It comes down to two options. Either the force of the water and the tearing of the ship twisted the steel walls so relentlessly that they created an impenetrable sarcophagus of rubble on top of the vehicle, hiding it perfectly. Or there is a much darker answer. The very real possibility that the official cargo manifest used to pay out fortunes in insurance claims did not reflect the physical reality of that sealed compartment the second the water swallowed it. If the automobile is not at the bottom, the question that echoes is the one most feared by official historians. Where was it the day the world changed and the ship broke in half? The answer to the void left on the seafloor might be locked far above the surface, hidden inside corporate vaults and restricted court archives. The mystery of the cargo hold takes on a darker tone when we analyze the behavior of those who hold the monopoly over the wreckage. Between the years of 1987 and 2004, the corporation holding the exclusive salvage rights made multiple descents. With the help of high-tech submarines, they scoured the crushed hallways and brought over 5,500 salvaged artifacts up to the light, rescuing them from the silence. But before we explore the secrets locked in those vaults and what they haven't told us, have you ever stopped to think about the sheer complexity that allowed this giant of steel to hide so many mysteries? To grasp the exact layout of the submerged compartments, the engineering of the boilers, and the brutal scale of every single level, our team put together a documented breakdown called The Anatomy of the Giant. This is a complete digital dossier featuring precise diagrams and genuine photographs from the era, showing the mechanical guts that movie screens chose to hide. If you appreciate deep historical research and want this file in your hands, the fully secure link is pinned in the first comment right below this video. Take a look at it later. Returning to the mechanical claws of the submarines, we know they tore through the darkness and accessed critical parts of the lower deck. From that specific level, the machines hoisted leather suitcases still preserved by the abyssal cold. They brought up personal belongings of the elite and fragments of heavy cargo. Everything that broke the surface of the saltwater was immediately cleaned, strictly cataloged internally, and stored away. It is true that a fraction of this historical treasure traveled the globe, displayed in massive touring exhibits for a fascinated public. However, the real documentary tension does not lie in what was put under the museum lights. The most disturbing element of this equation is the institutional silence. The complete inventory, the meticulous list of every single object pulled from that sealed compartment, was never published for independent researchers to review. A colossal gap of distrust formed between what the customs document claimed on the surface and what the corporation quietly kept in its restricted access storage. That fog of uncertainty became practically impenetrable starting in the year 2016. That was the exact moment the company responsible for the salvage operations went into an unstoppable financial collapse. Following the official declaration of bankruptcy, mountains of physical files and computer records holding the raw truth of what was found in the dark became the center of a ruthless legal battle in United States courts. On one side of this courtroom war, government authorities, trying to protect historical heritage, On the other, groups of private investors looking to liquidate assets to recover fortunes. And locked right in the middle of this white-collar litigation rests the definitive answer about the missing cargo. The heaviest and darkest detail of this prolonged secrecy involves the families of those left behind that early morning. There is very strong evidence suggesting that priceless artifacts were pulled from the depths of the hold, yet the legal heirs of the victims never received a formal, honest notification. The entire process of identifying original owners and storing the precious goods took place behind closed doors. No outside committee was allowed to audit what came out of the water. What the artificial lights illuminated on that exact piece of steel, where the declared luxuries were supposed to be, remains under an absolute veil of secrecy. It turned the salvage mission into a legal puzzle that seems to have no end. The most disturbing element of the lower deck isn't the registered cargo that vanished into the dark waters. The real ghost-haunting researchers is exactly what was never written on any piece of paper. There is a hidden layer to this story, a deliberate blind spot that is rarely debated in public. To understand what was truly locked in the dark, we need to look behind the financial curtains of 1912 and understand how the rulers of mankind's destiny operated. Back then, customs tax evasion was an extremely common and quietly accepted practice among the global elite. The wealthiest first-class passengers frequently traveled with uncalculable fortunes that simply could not pass the screening of authorities upon arrival in the United States. We are talking about safes lined with loose diamonds, gold bars, massive volumes of cold cash, and confidential business bonds representing the control of entire industries. If these high-value items were detailed on the ship's official manifest, the taxation on American soil would be financially devastating. The elite solution was simple and straightforward. The ghost cargo, accounts from surviving crew members quietly gathered right after the disaster, point to some shady movement at the English port. Days before departure, eyewitnesses watched private servants and high-ranking staff escorting incredibly heavy bags and solid wood trunks straight down to the cargo hold in the dead of night. This immensely valuable luggage skipped the official inspection. It bypassed the registry scales and went straight into the armored compartments. All of this relied on the total complicity of the shipping line's officers, men who would never dare question or cross the direct orders of the magnates funding their own operations. This breach of protocol is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented fact given under oath. During the British inquiry held right after the tragedy to investigate the causes and failures of the crossing, a worker in charge of boarding was cornered by the investigators' questions. With no way to back down, he ended up confessing that the ship set sail carrying, in his exact words, an extra cargo of unspecified nature. Sturdy crates and sealed bags that boarded the ocean liner completely outside the normal cataloging process, locked away securely on the deepest level of the vessel. And this is exactly where the merciless physics of the shipwreck crash head-on with the secrets of millionaires. When the massive block of ice caused that extensive submerged lateral scrape, freezing water immediately flooded the lower areas, always starting from the bow of the ship. The exact deck where these undeclared suitcases and safes rested was swallowed and sealed by the brutal pressure of the water in a matter of minutes, way before panic took hold of the luxury areas on the upper levels. And when the colossal steel structure could not support its own weight, breaking violently in half in absolute darkness, this invisible fortune was hurled to the bottom of the ocean floor. Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when putting together a puzzle, only to realize the most valuable pieces were hidden on purpose? Think about the mathematical gravity of this situation. If the items registered on paper were already worth millions of dollars and sparked massive insurance payouts, what would be the true value of this shadow cargo? The most terrifying aspect is that since these fortunes were never officially declared to authorities, Their owners died in the freezing water without leaving a single legal trace of their existence. The heirs could never sue the insurance companies for bags of precious stones or bonds that, in the cold eyes of the law, never even boarded the ship. This throws us violently back to the silence of the modern expeditions. When the deep-sea submarines descended, their spotlights slicing through the abyssal dark to scour the twisted wreckage. What did they actually find in the mud? If the mechanical claws picked up this undeclared luggage, the corporation found the most perfect treasure in the world, a locked, highly valuable treasure with no official owner, a priceless asset with no customs record forcing its return to descendants. The inventory of what the corporation pulled up remains kept away from the public, and whatever was hidden in that hold, far from the eyes of the law, might have changed hands a century later, camouflaged in the silence of courts and wealthy private collections. The relentless clock of the ocean is about to close the final door on this investigation. To grasp the gravity of what is left of the cargo hold, we need to jump forward in time to the year 2023. It was right at this moment that researchers and engineers carried out the most meticulous, detailed, and absolute digital mapping in the entire history of that debris field. Using autonomous, high-resolution, underwater drones, they spent hundreds of hours sweeping the seabed. They didn't just light up specific spots with spotlights. They stitched together millions of individual images to create a flawless, three-dimensional model of the broken vessel. And the crystal-clear images that returned to the surface revealed a cruel and definitive physical truth. The giant of steel isn't just resting lifeless at the bottom of the North Atlantic. It is dying for a second time. The scanned images brought to light an extremely aggressive and totally unstoppable structural collapse. The front section of the ocean liner, the very one that plunged first into the freezing dawn and took the brutal impact against the ocean floor, is caving in with each passing day. G-deck, the deepest level of the ship's engineering, home to the heavy security doors of the cargo hold, is slowly being crushed from top to bottom. Entire layers of reinforced steel, former operational rooms, and upper luxury decks have caved in, creating an accordion effect on the lower level. Whatever the impact against the massive block of ice didn't destroy over a century ago, the monumental weight of the ruins themselves is now turning into dust. And the microscopic enemy accelerating this constant destruction is not just the brutal pressure of the massive column of salt water at over 10,000 feet deep. The giant structure is being eaten alive by colonies of iron-feeding bacteria. These relentless microorganisms form massive rust-colored stalactites known to scientists as rusticles, hanging like solid tears from every exposed fracture of the hull. The digestion process of these organisms is slow, quiet, and absolutely devastating to the physical integrity of what is left. According to the meticulous analysis of engineers and oceanographers, the window of time to explore and decode the secrets of that cargo hold is closing irreversibly. The most precise mathematical calculations show that the entire lower compartment will become completely inaccessible in a span of less than 15 years. The end of this story will not be brought about by violent ocean currents or new legal restrictions in human courts. The main hold will be locked and sealed for eternity by the collapse of its own colossal walls. Thousands of tons of weakened, corroded metal will violently crash down onto the floor of G-deck, burying once and for all any material evidence still holding on in the freezing dark. That very same armored vault, where first-class passengers blindly trusted their greatest fortunes, will melt together, becoming a massive, impenetrable block of twisted steel, mixed forever with the dense mud of the abyss. Whatever was not brought to the surface will definitively belong to the sea. Have you ever stopped to notice the devastating, almost poetic irony of this whole investigation? We have the original, bureaucratic customs documents stored dry in dusty archives. We own submarines with robotic technology advanced enough to withstand the most hostile and extreme conditions on the blue planet. We know the exact geographical coordinates where the structure rests. We have even witnessed the selective recovery of thousands of artifacts brought to light by billion-dollar corporations, keeping their logs and balances under heavy lock and key. Yet somehow inexplicably, the core truth remains out of reach, slipping right through our fingers. Even with all our scientific progress, what actually and legally rested in the sealed guts of the ocean liner when the relentless water broke in remains one of the largest and most uncomfortable blind spots in modern exploration. The heavy, indestructible French vehicle that was never tracked by powerful sonars, the dark, undeclared fortunes that boarded in the dead of night while bribed officers looked the other way. The priceless belongings of those who slowly sank into the dark and could never demand justice from courts on solid ground. 114 years after that fateful voyage of no return, the central question of this mystery keeps echoing without a full answer, lost in the silence and the absolute void of deep waters. The cargo hold opened its doors, but it refused to give up its soul. On April 10th, 1912, the absolute peak of maritime engineering set sail from the English port, carrying the ultimate promise of invincibility. On that morning, before the massive mooring ropes were cast off, a strict and detailed document was signed by port authorities and commanding officers. This document was the official baggage manifest, a bureaucratic, cold, and purely mathematical list that meticulously recorded every ounce of material wealth, every luxury vehicle, and every heavy crate that went down to the cargo hold in the isolated and unreachable lower level. That fragile paper, made of early 20th century cellulose and ink, survived the relentless passage of decades. It was preserved bone dry, protected in climate-controlled drawers of government archives, and backed the payout of massive fortunes in mainland courts. To the laws of men, the document represented the absolute truth. But the colossal steel compartment it described did not share the same fate. The hold sank in the freezing dawn, hopelessly swallowed by the North Atlantic water, sealed by the abyssal darkness on a night with absolutely no moon. When the technological expeditions of our era finally crossed the abyss, and the artificial lights of the submarines ripped through the gloom of that collapsed maze 73 years later, the accounting truth crashed violently head-on with the physical reality of the ocean floor. What rested in there, crushed under relentless tons of pressure, did not fully match what was written and validated on paper. Heavy structures of solid iron that could never dissolve in salt water simply vanished. And in the place of those glaring absences, dark traces of a cargo completely invisible to the authorities emerged. Undeclared wealth that boarded in the shadows, far from inspectors and scales, belonging to the same financial elite that dictated the rules of the world on the surface. And the great anomaly didn't stop growing on the seabed. It continued to bloom in modern offices and courtrooms. The exact inventory of everything the mechanical claws actually pulled from that sector over several decades of complex corporate exploration was never published for the world. Instead of delivering the clear answers that history and the archives demanded, those in charge locked the discovered artifacts inside private vaults. The secret lists and operational reports became the core of a hostile and endless legal dispute, fought between billionaire investors and government agencies focused on historical heritage. Meanwhile, the true heirs of those left behind in the freezing dark remain sidelined from the facts, never knowing the total truth about the final traces left by their ancestors. But nature, with its patient and relentless force, is about to shut down this bureaucratic debate for good in the most drastic and undeniable way possible. The ultra-high-resolution three-dimensional scan, executed with absolute precision in the year 2023, handed us an irrefutable physical sentence. The giant vessel of 4 smokestacks is collapsing in a terminal way, the lowest and most isolated level of the entire naval engineering, which housed the secure cargo area, is being violently crushed from the top down by the massive weight of the upper decks, caving in with every new day. The steel that survived the terror of the long lateral scrape against the block of ice is now being eaten alive, and in total silence, by billions of microscopic bacteria. They are turning the once indestructible beams into orange dust, dissolving perfectly with the lightest drift of the ocean current. The greatest engineers and oceanographers of today confirm a mathematically irreversible scenario. In a strict time frame of less than 15 years, the sealed hold will vanish completely from human sight and from the reach of any existing robotic technology. It won't be the unbearable depth of the ocean that stops us from finding the massive missing pieces of this intricate puzzle. It will be the cataclysmic, final collapse of the thick metal walls. Thousands of tons of severely corroded debris will crash down without warning, obliterating the old floor of the cargo level once and for all. Whatever is camouflaged beneath the thick mud or tightly wedged under the metal plates will be compressed and fused to the Earth's crust on the seafloor. This is the heaviest and most enduring reflection we can take away from the forgotten ruins of this monumental colossus. The famous cargo hold has been physically, legally, and bureaucratically sealed from the very first moments of the night of the sinking in the year 1912. It absorbed and silenced the extreme vanity, the dark financial secrets, and the uncalculable hidden fortunes of an entire generation. A generation that, in its immense arrogance, blindly believed it was bigger and stronger than the force of the sea itself. And even though modern mankind has managed to break physical barriers and send advanced robotic cameras down to the deepest, most desolate point of the dark, the complete historical truth has astonishingly kept slipping through the cracks of our fingers. The deep water swallowed the heavy, physical structure. Human courts swallowed the investigative papers. And in a very short horizon, the collapsed steel ruin itself will swallow the tiny empty space it still has left. The ancient compartment, silently sealed in the dark of the world's floor, perfectly fulfilled its ultimate mission to protect what was never meant to be seen again, the dense, quiet mystery that has been locked inside there since that tragic dawn will remain strictly locked, this time and for all eternity, and